here. Dieter, thank you for the introduction, and Emmanuel. I have to say, when Richard Bellamy first suggested to me that I might come here at this point to give a lecture, I thought, was this rather cowardly of me to escape from the rather fevered atmosphere in Britain at the moment, delightful though it would be and is to be here. But then I thought, well, the way things are going at the moment, maybe this would be my last chance to get such an invitation. So I accepted with alacrity, and we can talk about as we come up to questions and answers. I'm very happy to obviously to talk about the referendum as I see it, because I have been doing a certain amount of campaigning on the Remain side. I chose the title Lessons from a Small Island because I really copied it from the title of a book by the American Bill Bryson called Notes from a Small Island. And it starts really, of course, with geography, because if you are an island surrounded by the sea, your view of the world is different. The famous, the famous, even we British can see the humour of it. The famous Times headline: "Fog in Channel, continent cut off." Not Britain that's cut off, but of course also, I mean, if until the 20th century you could only be approached by the sea, that both gives you a defence. It gives you a different psychological attitude, and it means when you do depart from your island, you may stop at Calais, but you may equally not stop until you get to China. So it gives you both a narrow view and perhaps also a world view. And it certainly gives you a tendency to think that what you have is the best of all possible worlds. A Venetian traveller to Britain in the early 16th century recorded that the British people he met, the Londoners he met, thought that they had the best clothing and the best food and the best standards of everything that there could possibly be. So on the one hand, you have that insularity. On the other hand, this is the world in which there grew up Thomas More, who, along with Erasmus, was one of the great cultural figures of that period. So it's a very mixed picture. But at the heart of it, of course, is centuries of Britain, not always successfully, because after all we were invaded by the Romans, the Anglo-Saxons, the Vikings, the Normans, and even briefly in the 17th century by the Dutch, who successfully sailed up the Thames and broke the barrier that was supposed to keep their fleet at bay. So we weren't always successful in resisting continental encroachment, but resisting continental encroachment was a big feature of British life. And if you look at the history of the English Reformation, Henry VIII's relationship with the Pope and the advent of Protestantism in England, that is as much about, if not more about politics than it is about religion. Dieter mentioned that I worked for a time for the Catholic Church. My father was not a Roman Catholic. He was a Methodist, a Wesleyan, a form of Protestantism, for those not familiar with it. But my mother was a Roman Catholic. And in those days, the Roman Catholic Church insisted that in any mixed marriage, the non-Catholic partner would make a written undertaking that the children of the marriage would be brought up as Catholics. And my father made that undertaking. And he received a letter from his aunt. His aunt, obviously, like him, a non-Catholic, lived in Derbyshire, rural area in the centre of Britain, and my father's family had been generations of sheep farmers, and she said, "Never forget that here in one of the churchyards of Derbyshire are buried generations of members of the Wall family. These are yeoman stock, the breath and backbone of England, and do not allow your children to be put under the yoke of popery." Now, this letter was written in 1931, not 1531. And my aunt had not the first conception of the Immaculate Conception or the Ascension or whatever. What she was talking about was the papacy as basically seen to be a foreign power interfering in the affairs of the United Kingdom. So it's partly against that background, and then, of course, more obviously, the background of our emergence from the Second World War with a very different view of the world from that of those countries that became our continental neighbours. For all of whom, first of all, the coal and steel community and then the European community were a very positive development, because their institutions had either been disgraced, as was the case of Germany and Italy, or humiliated, as was the case for those countries, and almost destroyed, as was the case for those countries that had been under occupation. That had not been our story, and we had, of course, formed a close relationship with our fellow English language speakers in the United States, and that relationship continued in the form of a close defense relationship and a close intelligence relationship. And, of course, also, at the end of World War II, we still had an empire, not for very much longer, but we were still an imperial power and saw ourselves in those terms. More importantly, in economic terms, Britain's principal markets were not in the continent of Europe. They were to an extent in the United States, but they were primarily in the countries of the so-called Old Commonwealth. So up to at least the mid-1950s, Britain's principal export market was to a country of 10 million people, namely Australia. So there were a number of reasons, partly our perception of ourselves, partly hard-headed trade interest at the time, why Britain, when the coal and steel community was formulated, and then the European community, why Britain stood back. There were, in a classic British way, real doubts about whether these new institutions would work. The British Foreign Office, in which I spent my career, believed right up until the year before the Treaty of Rome that the project was doomed to failure, such that when the British Treasury, the British Finance Ministry, started to say in about 1956, look, if this organization, this proposed organization actually succeeds, we may find it's economically so powerful that we will need to join it. And the response from a senior Foreign Office official at the time was, well, we needn't worry because it won't succeed. And Britain, as we know, saw, insofar as it needed that kind of European cooperation, the European Free Trade Area, which it had invented in part to annoy the French, that EFTA would be able to rival the European community. And that turned out very quickly to be a completely false dawn. So that within a relatively short period of time, including, of course, on the back of the humiliation of the Suez debacle, where Britain and France's invasion was scuppered basically by the United States, among other things, the French certainly reached a conclusion about their foreign policy. Britain reached a conclusion which was we should never again get across the United States, but it was also a painful reminder of a very changed world. So Harold Macmillan, the Prime Minister who persuaded a rather reluctant British cabinet that they should apply for membership of the European community, when they took that decision at the beginning of the 1960s, Macmillan was very conscious of the fact, and his principal reasoning, which he set out in a pamphlet which he wrote and was sent around the country to British homes, was that Britain was living in a world where there were two superpowers. Those two superpowers were the Soviet Union and the United States, with China, as Macmillan said, China coming up fast as well. And if Britain wanted to exercise influence in the world, and he was talking about political influence more than economic influence, if Britain wanted to exercise influence in the world, it needed to be part of that grouping of like-minded countries. So the British, rather reluctantly, and with divisions within the main parties, divisions within Harold Macmillan's Conservative Party, and certainly divisions within the opposition Labour Party, the then leader of the Labour Party, Hugh Gaitskell, famously said at a party conference, to join the common market would be the end of 1,000 years of history. Against that background of divisions within the political parties, divisions within the country, the British government applied to join, and through 1962, they, and I would say certainly 5 of the original 6 founding members, believed that those negotiations were likely to succeed. But as we know, in January 1963, President de Gaulle cast his veto, which prevented Britain joining. And I was 16 at the time, and it was a sense, there was a sense both of national humiliation and a sense of grievance. I mean, the sense of grievance came from the view that, in 1940, when de Gaulle was a relatively little-known junior French general, he had been received in London, and that the British government had recognized him, self-appointed as he was, had nonetheless recognized him as the true representative of France, whereas the United States, for example, continued to recognize the Vichy government right up until 1943. So there was a sense of kind of ingratitude on the one hand, and there was probably, on de Gaulle's part, a certain element of kind of this is revenge time for his treatment at the hands of the Anglo-Saxons. But if you read de Gaulle's press conference speech, it's a very hard-headed analysis of French national interest. And what de Gaulle is, and I'm obviously paraphrasing, but what he basically is saying in that speech is, look, here is an organization set up before I returned to power as president, square brackets, whose supranational institutions I don't much like, but which represents French interests very clearly. First of all, in terms of the relationship that it gives France with Germany, and a very leading and preponderant role for France in this organization of six, and more particularly, its structure and its budgetary arrangements, basically a protected zone in the customs union, and an agricultural policy designed to support French agricultural overproduction through export subsidy. This suits France's interests very well. And of course, all that, de Gaulle is saying, will change dramatically if Britain joins, because Britain's interests are trading interests with the wider world, much more interested in liberal trade than France is. And de Gaulle said, Britain will bring in its wake many, many more other countries. I mean, de Gaulle foresaw, and he was the only person, I think, subject to correction, but the only person, certainly a politician at the time, who was, he could foresee, as he put it, a European community of 18 members, whereas nobody was really thinking in those. Nobody else was thinking in those terms. So he had good, hard-headed reasons from a French perspective to turn down the British application. But it was a big humiliation. Harold Macmillan was more or less forced out of office a few months later, and it was partly the humiliation of Europe. And his Conservative government, for the remainder of its time in office, had to basically withdraw the application and pay no more attention to the European community. In 1974, in October 1974, a Labour government under its new leader, Harold Wilson, was elected. Wilson's view was that the European Free Trade Association was the way to go, and some kind of relationship between EFTA and the European community was the way forward. But Wilson was very quickly persuaded, not least by two of his principal fellow government members, George Brown and Michael Stewart, that actually EFTA was simply not an adequate vehicle for British purposes, either economically or, again, and this was equally important, in terms of exercising political influence. And Wilson, over a period of time, gradually conditioned the country and his party to another attempt to join. Wilson called a second election in 1966, massively increased his majority. And then he and George Brown, his deputy, who was by then Foreign Secretary, did a tour, a very extensive tour of the capitals of the six, including long meetings with de Gaulle, where de Gaulle was polite but very non-committal, to the point of making it pretty clear that he wasn't to be persuaded about the case for British membership. At the time, Wilson, kind of trailing his coat around Europe, was rather ridiculed in the British press, but it was a clever political maneuver, because when he came to the point of getting the approval of his cabinet for Britain applying, and the cabinet was pretty divided, even those members of the cabinet who were rather hostile to the idea of membership were basically saying, look, we've committed so much political capital in this that we'd look stupid now if we weren't at least seen to make the attempt. And so the attempt was made, and as we know, de Gaulle vetoed once again in 1967. But although the British government at the time were not certain up to the point of the veto that it would actually happen, there was a bit of them that thought that de Gaulle wouldn't again court the anger of the other five governments in vetoing. But anyway, they were nonetheless prepared. And interestingly, of course, the state of the British economy at the time meant that compared with 1963, the other 5 members of the European Community were less cross with de Gaulle than they had been 4 years earlier, because their fear was that if Britain joined at that point, they would be having to bail out sterling. But Wilson, in response to de Gaulle's veto, said, "I will not take no for an answer." In other words, he maintained the application on the table, so that when, in 1969, de Gaulle fell from power and Pompidou became French president, Pompidou was persuaded, not least by Willy Brandt, the German chancellor, to accept that negotiations should open with Britain. But, Pompidou was not a clever French president for nothing, and insisted that before the negotiations begin, the future financing of the European Community should be decided by the 6, and the arrangements that we now know, the own resources system, was devised, and it was evident to the British and others that financial arrangement would be very, very disadvantageous to Britain, such that the British believed, and as it turned out correctly believed, that as then one of the poorer of what became the 9 member states, poorer than any of the member states except perhaps Italy and Ireland, Britain would nonetheless be, along with Germany, the only net contributor to the budget, as opposed to everybody else being net recipients from the budget. And indeed, the Wilson government and subsequently the Heath government considered whether they should go ahead in those circumstances. But they concluded that membership was too important to delay, and that if Britain delayed, we would have to come back cap in hand and maybe get worse terms later on. So Wilson was on the point of embarking on the negotiations when he called a snap election in the summer of 1970. He was very far ahead of the Conservatives in the opinion polls, but to everybody's surprise, he lost the election to Ted Heath. So it was Heath who picked up basically the negotiating mandate that otherwise would have been fulfilled by a Labour government. And although Ted Heath himself was probably the most committedly pro-European of any British Prime Minister, he too had divisions within his own party. In that election, there were Conservative candidates who stood for election, and within their own constituencies, they stood on an anti-European platform. Enoch Powell denied a place in the cabinet because of his infamous racist speech a few years earlier, was nonetheless a powerful figure in the Conservative Party, and Heath was very quickly being advised that Enoch Powell was positioning himself as an anti-European because he saw this as a way of overthrowing Heath for the leadership of the Conservative Party. So that was the basis on which Heath went into the negotiations. And of course, at the same time, the Labour Party in opposition, desperate to get rid of a Conservative government which they felt had almost unjustly wrested power from them, quite cross with their leader, Harold Wilson, A, because he'd lost them the election, B, because he'd been paid a 6-figure sum to go away and write his memoirs and was not paying very much attention to party politics. The Labour Party started to move rather fast towards an anti-European stance. So in the spring of 1971, at the very moment when Heath and Pompidou were meeting in Paris for a historic meeting which opened the door to British accession, Jim Callaghan, who had been Chancellor of the Exchequer and Home Secretary under the Labour government, and was, of course, a future Foreign Secretary and Prime Minister, Jim Callaghan made a speech and Jim Callaghan had always been in favour of British membership. Jim Callaghan made a speech which has become known as the language of Chaucer speech, because Pompidou had given an interview at about the time of Heath's visit to the British Panorama, BBC Panorama programme, in which he said that he welcomed Britain as a future member of the European Community, but he hoped that French would nonetheless remain the language of the community. So, said Callaghan, so, Monsieur Pompidou, does that mean that it's only with French permission that in future we can use the language of Chaucer and Milton and Shakespeare? Well, said Callaghan, I've got a message for you, and for clarity's sake, I'll give you the message in French. Non merci beaucoup. Now, Callaghan had telephoned the editor of the Times saying, you must send somebody to cover this speech, my speech, because this will be the speech of the next leader of the Labour Party. So it was a bid for the leadership. That telephone call was reported to Harold Wilson, who was on a visit to Helsinki, within 40 minutes of it taking place. So Wilson was faced with a situation where he had three pro-marketeers, or semi-pro-marketeers, Callaghan, Tony Crosland, and Dennis Healey, very senior members of the party, who had switched to being anti-European, and the assurance that he got from the leading pro-European, Roy Jenkins, that Roy Jenkins, would not challenge Wilson for the leadership if Wilson stuck to a pro-European line. Wilson knew that that promise was worth nothing, not least because Roy Jenkins was an inveterate conspirator against Wilson. So that's why the Labour Party began to drift towards very clear and open hostility to membership of the European community, almost regardless of the terms. And initially, when the idea that they might offer the British people a referendum if returned to power on the issue of membership, it was rejected by the shadow cabinet, but gradually they moved towards it. And Wilson found himself in a situation where, in order to prevent the party from coming out in favour of total opposition to membership and a commitment to reverse it, to leave if Labour were returned to power, Wilson first of all had to threaten his own resignation as leader, and secondly to promise that in some form, either a general election or a referendum, the British people would be consulted on the back of a renegotiation of the terms. Meanwhile, Heath was concluding those terms, and the Labour opposition denounced them, saying this is not what we would have negotiated, but in fact there were a whole range of senior Labour figures, ministers in the previous Labour government, who stood up in Parliament and said, actually, if we had remained in power, these are exactly the terms we would have negotiated. But Heath faced a divided House of Commons, and if all the anti-European rebels in his own party had voted against him, as some of them threatened to do, and equally, had there not been rebels within the Labour Party who voted in favour of membership against the instructions of their party, then Heath would have not carried the determination to join the European community through the House of Commons. Indeed, he went down to the House of Commons with a resignation speech in his pocket. So the controversy was there even at the moment that Britain joined. And the first year of British membership, 1973, was a difficult year. In very characteristic fashion, I don't think it was at the first meeting of the General Affairs Council, but the second meeting of the General Affairs Council, attended by Alec Douglas-Home, former British Prime Minister, now British Foreign Secretary. Alec Douglas-Home thought it would be a good idea to tell his partners how, up until this point, they hadn't really been running the meetings as efficiently as they might, and here were some suggestions as to how they could be reformed. As you can imagine, this went down like a lead balloon. But more seriously, that first year was, first of all, rather fractious in terms of Britain's relations with her partners, partly, again, because of the weakness of the British economy. It was also, though, interestingly, a very fractious year in European-American relations. Henry Kissinger, the US Secretary of State, made his famous speech, I think in April 73, declaring 1973 the year of Europe. He had not consulted a single European before he did so. And Heath, who seriously believed that the European Union, not in military terms, but in other terms, could rival the United States as a superpower, Heath made a supposedly off-the-record speech to American correspondents in London, which was probably the most vitriolic attack on an American administration made by any British Prime Minister post-war. And of course, within seconds, it was reported back to Washington, and they knew exactly who had given the speech. And Kissinger summoned the then British ambassador in Washington and said to him, your government has single-handedly destroyed the special relationship. And in particular, Kissinger said, we wanted you, the British, to join the European community because we thought you would constrain the French. And in fact, what we see you doing is kowtowing to the French. So Anglo-American relations were strained. And then towards the end of the year, of course, the Yom Kippur War and the oil crisis provoked a situation in which, because of their position towards Palestine, France and Britain were protected from the worst effects of the oil embargo that the Arabs imposed after the Yom Kippur War, and both France and Britain failed to show solidarity with our other partners. And interestingly, by the time you get to the turn of the year, 73, 74, And Heath was starting to worry that as we came towards the kind of transition period following British accession, that this issue of the British net contribution would start to become serious politics. Heath's instructions to his Foreign Secretary, Douglas Hume, were to make no concessions about a common energy policy unless Britain got some concessions on what was then the incipient idea of structural funds on the basis that Britain would get money from the structural funds. That particular saga ended because Heath called a Who Governs Britain election at the start of 1974 on the back of a very serious miners' strike, and Heath lost the election, and Wilson, on the basis of a minority government, was returned to power with a commitment to renegotiate the terms of British membership. Jim Callaghan, as Foreign Secretary, led those negotiations. And unlike David Cameron, Wilson adopted a rather different tactic. David Cameron, if any of you have read his Bloomberg speech of 2.5 years ago or so, the speech that started the process which is about to come to an end, Cameron's speech is very much a speech of two halves. In the first half, he's basically saying everything that's wrong with the European Union and needs dramatic reform. But the second half is a passionate plea for the importance of the European Union, such that when I read it, I thought the conclusion I reached was, here is a man who is basically telling his audience that the renegotiation is almost actually irrelevant in terms of the importance to the British national interest of remaining in the European Union. Wilson took a very different line. Wilson's line was, I will make up my mind as to what position to take and what recommendation to make in the light of the negotiation. And the negotiation started very slowly. Pompidou, who disliked Wilson for reasons I didn't bore you with, Pompidou was adamant that no concessions should be made, reinforced in his view by Edward Heath, now leader of the opposition, whom Pompidou liked a lot, telling him, look, Wilson will have to have a second general election before long, and he will lose it and will be returned to power, so you needn't bother. Meanwhile, however, Wilson and Callaghan, who, whatever they were saying publicly, had clearly privately concluded that this negotiation needed to succeed, and had certainly given that impression without being explicit to the officials who worked for them. Wilson and Callaghan accepted an important piece of advice that was given to them by an official called Michael Palliser, who was the first British permanent representative in Brussels, which was that the only chance of a successful negotiation was if it was made clear to our partners from the beginning that Britain would not seek to change either the Treaty of Rome or the terms of the accession negotiation. And Wilson and Callaghan managed to get that past their cabinet before the skeptics in the cabinet realized really how significant a move that was. And after Pompidou's untimely death from cancer in the spring of 1974, with the advent of Giscard d'Estaing, the mood did shift. Giscard took a more pragmatic approach. And by the time you get to the autumn of 74, when Helmut Schmidt, the German Chancellor, came and famously addressed in brilliant English and with tremendous good humor and turned round a hostile audience at the Labour Party conference, you have Harold Wilson saying after Schmidt's visit, saying to Callaghan, I can now see my way through to a successful conclusion of this negotiation. The things that Britain was asking for, I needn't bother you with, because they were, for the most part, relatively insignificant. One was reform of the common agricultural policy, because food prices rising as they had done in the early days of British membership was a significant domestic issue. But by coincidence, world food prices rose in that year, which removed that problem. Secondly was continued access for New Zealand beef and lamb to the British and EU market. And this may seem very bizarre, but if you look back to the Heath negotiation, which took us into the European Union, there were two big issues at the end of that negotiation. One was the financing, the budget, and the other was access for New Zealand butter and New Zealand lamb. And you'd think this was a no-brainer, that the budget issue would be the more important issue. But in British domestic politics, New Zealand was a country that had fought with us in World War II, that after World War II, when Britain was short of food, had made sacrifices to supply us with food. So the kind of kith and kin argument was very powerful. And for Wilson, who had something like 16 second cousins living in New Zealand, it was personally important. And he never never really took seriously the budget issue, although Callaghan, as a former Chancellor of the Exchequer, did. Wilson didn't think it would resonate with the British public. So by the time the negotiation came to its conclusion, in the spring of 1975 at Dublin, the deal that was on the table for New Zealand butter and lamb was a good one. The deal that was on the table for some kind of compensation to the British was rather a bad one, partly because of clever negotiating by German officials and ministers. And Michael Butler, who was at the time the senior British Foreign Office official, used to recall that on the last day of that European summit, he was trying to brief Wilson and Callaghan that this was not a good deal and shouldn't be accepted. But it was Wilson's birthday, and the clever people in the council secretariat had baked him a cake. And he wanted to go off and have lunch and have his birthday cake. And Michael Butler recalled Callaghan saying, "Harold, listen, you should listen to what Michael is saying. This is really important." But Wilson wasn't intent on listening, and so a deal was done. And part of the later problem over the whole British rebate was the fact that that deal didn't work from a British perspective. But from Wilson's perspective, he believed that he'd got enough to get the deal through his cabinet, which he did by a reasonable majority, and more particularly enough to get the support of the British people. And by that stage, in terms of opinion polls, the in camp were 8 percentage points ahead of the out camp, and that lead steadily increased throughout the period of the referendum campaign, culminating in the referendum in June 1975, in which, roughly speaking, 2/3 of the British people voted by 2/3 to stay in the European community, with a varied pattern of voting throughout the United Kingdom, but the only bits of the United Kingdom that actually voted to come out were the Orkney Islands and Shetland. So compared with the situation that we're likely to see in Britain in 2 weeks' time, a very different outcome. I think, just to digress for a second, we might get a high turnout. I think there will be a narrow margin for whichever side wins, and I think we will see big regional variations. I mean, we will see London and other big cities vote in favour. But to take an example, Cambridge will almost certainly vote to stay in. Peterborough, a big city only a few miles away, will almost certainly vote to leave. Scotland will vote to remain. Northern Ireland will vote to remain. Wales probably, although there's quite a big leave movement in Wales. Gibraltar, where people have a vote, there are 30,000 voters in Gibraltar, and 29,999 of them will vote to remain. But in England, I think we will see quite big regional differences in England, with different parts of England voting in different ways. And at the moment, it's touch and go what the final result will be. At the end of the Labour government in '79, this issue of the British budget contribution had risen right to the top of the agenda. Jim Callaghan was making speeches, big public speeches about it in Britain, and starting to agitate about it within the European community. So it was almost the first thing on Margaret Thatcher's agenda. And she saw it. I mean, she's famous in the European Union annals for, I want my money back. But if you look at the documentation, first of all, she believed that there was, and I believe she was right, there was an injustice in the financing system. But secondly, you keep seeing these references to the fact that if this is not resolved, this will make British membership of the European Union untenable, because it will arouse yet again all the controversy within the Conservative Party, and the Labour Party by this time anyway was turning once again towards total hostility to membership of the European community. So she basically fought a battle which went on from 1979 right through to 1984. So you have a situation really where Britain, having waited against its wishes to join for the period of the de Gaulle vetoes, then spent the first 10 years and more of its membership effectively renegotiating the terms of what it saw as an inequitable arrangement. And what whatever your position on the rights and wrongs, that became a fact of political life in Britain, and it coloured Margaret Thatcher's views of the European community. Not such that she was not then one of the principal proponents of the single market, and as we know, accepted the biggest shift from unanimity to majority voting in the history of the European community. She did all that, and she did that at a time when her relations with Jacques Delors, as the new president of the Commission, were very good. She liked Jacques Delors. She would have supported, because she didn't think it was the kind of the turn of the French. She would have supported a German candidate had the Germans come up with a candidate, or failing that, Etienne d'Avignon, for whom she had a very high regard. But when that candidature didn't prosper, partly because of German opposition, she supported Jacques Delors because she had seen that as French finance minister he had turned around the economy, and she felt that he and she were on the same wavelength in terms of economic policy. So the shift away from Delors coincided with the fact that at heart, of course, not just at heart, by politics, Jacques Delors was a socialist. His speech to the Trade Union Congress conference in 1988 in Britain provoked her wrath as being a speech which was kind of hostile to her as a conservative. And his conception of the future of the European Union, gradually enunciated, and most famously enunciated in the form of the European Commission being the administration of the Union, answerable to the European Parliament and to the European Council, which would be, as it were, the second chamber. That to her was an anathema. So the Bruges speech of September 1988, which is worth rereading because by today's standards it looks like a rather moderate speech, there were two things in it which were considered dynamite at the time. The first was, we have not rolled back the frontiers of the state in Britain to see them reimposed at European level from Brussels. And secondly, in what I think is actually rather a moving passage in the speech, this is after all before the fall of the Iron Curtain, let us never forget that Warsaw, Prague and Budapest are also great European cities. Now at the time, that was thought, oh well, there go the Brits, there they go, they want to widen the whole thing so that it kind of falls apart. But Margaret Thatcher's view, which was shared by her successor, John Major, was that the key reason for the European community, in her view, was freedom, democracy, and stability. And if you could extend freedom, democracy, and stability to the countries of Eastern and Central Europe, that was a great prize. And in any case, John Major used to argue, how can we, the rich countries of the West, say to these newly enfranchised countries coming out of the thrall of domination by the Soviet Union, how can we say to them, sorry guys, we've got our rich man's club, and you can't join. But the progression towards the kind of vision, the Delors vision, which was then shared largely, at least apparently shared largely, by all the other heads of government, and towards the single currency, was really the kind of turning point for her. She said at the time that the single currency was first being mooted in serious form, she said, for a single currency to work, you have to have the kind of political system you have inside a nation state, where there is political consensus for the wealthy regions giving money to the poorer regions. And you can only have that in something bigger than the nation state if you have political union. And that, for her, that political union was unacceptable. At the time she lost office, she was for total opposition to what became the Maastricht Treaty. The reason why John Major went for the opt-out was because he accepted the legal advice he was being given that our partners could go ahead with a treaty outside the framework of the community treaties, and therefore that Britain should let them go ahead while negotiating an opt-out, which was, at the time, the opt-in part of it was just as important as the opt-out part of it. In other words, Britain was not going to make the mistake it made by joining the European community late and paying a price. We would insist that if we did ever want to join the single currency, then we could do so without those kind of problems. So looking at the kind of the bilan of British membership, the British hesitations, to say the least, about institutional development, and in particular the erosion of the power of Parliament. This is not something which, contrary to what some people say today, we knew nothing about. Of course, we knew about it. But I think what is significant is at the time we joined, I mean, the records of conversations between Heath and Pompidou and Willy Brandt show all three of those leaders believing that the European community would be run by the large member states, and that if any one of the large member states really felt that an important national interest was at stake, then legislation to its detriment would not go ahead. So even Germany, that didn't sign up to the Luxembourg Compromise, took that view in practice. And as far as Britain was concerned, President Pompidou had made it a condition of British accession that Heath publicly sign up to the French interpretation of the Luxembourg Compromise. So British ministers believed that the Luxembourg Compromise, although they knew it didn't have the force of law, they nonetheless believed that politically it was tantamount to a veto. And it was not until 1982 when the British agriculture minister invoked the Luxembourg Compromise to prevent a price fixing and was voted down, including by the French, that Britain realized that the Luxembourg Compromise wasn't really worth the paper it wasn't written on. And that in itself, Margaret Thatcher's reaction to that was one of anger, but interestingly, it was anger because she said this will reopen the whole issue of Europe within the Conservative Party. So, but beyond that, as I see it, the British contribution in those years was, first of all, to say, and this was initially like spitting in church, that it makes no sense in a modern economy to have a policy, namely the Common Agricultural Policy, that takes up 75% of the budget and is producing butter mountains and beef mountains and food produce that can only be disposed of by subsidies and therefore damaging markets in developing countries. She was right to be the principal among heads of government, the principal protagonist of the single market, which after all had been there on the face of the Treaty of Rome since the very beginning, but about which very little had been done. And she, I believe, and her successors were right to promote the cause of enlargement within the European Union. Briefly, I mean, the issues now that confront us in Britain. The debate so far has been conducted in a way where we have, I think, ducked what to me is the kind of core issue, which is what is the political place of Britain in the world. And one of the reasons I stressed the fact that for Macmillan, for Heath, for Wilson, the politics were almost as important, if not more important, than the economy. I was at a dinner last night at which Radek Sikorski, not a man who minces his words, said, "I can't understand what you Brits are doing. You're about to throw away what has been 5 centuries of strategy, namely to prevent the development of too powerful a grouping of countries on the continent of Europe." Now, that's one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it is that we are maybe about to throw away the most precious thing that all of us together have created, which is out of the ruins of war. And one of my friends wears a badge saying 28 million reasons to vote to remain, the 28 million reasons being that in the 28 countries of what is now the European Union, in 2 world wars, 28 million people lost their lives. And about to throw away the part we have played in building up that post-war, with difficulty and continuing difficulty, but that crucial post-war institution which has played such an important part in our stability and prosperity. So on the Remain side, the debate so far has been much more about this will hurt you in your pocketbook, this is bad for you economically, because all the focus group work suggests that that's the only argument that resonates with a rather blinkered public opinion. And on the Leave side, it's a completely illusory Panglossian view. It's a mixture of untruths about the consequences of leaving, that it's all going to be benign and there will be broad sunlit uplands in which we will have a friendly relationship with our former partners, and a degree of nostalgia for a world that, if it ever existed, has long since been lost. So I think what we are seeing is something which is at one level uniquely British, but is also something that is in common with a kind of politics we're seeing throughout Western Europe and in the United States, which is, in a dangerous world with terrorist threats and the ISIS threat being of a particularly nasty kind, with the near collapse of capitalism, loss of respect for elites. What do? You go into your house and you close your front door, or you build a wall against Mexico. And the hostility to immigration and anti-immigration has played an increasing part, and rather successfully an increasing part, in the Leave campaign over the last week or two. Anti-immigration is another symbol of that feeling, and it's why I regret to say that people of my age and over, according to the opinion polls, are the group most likely to vote and most likely to vote to leave, because this is not the country. We no longer recognise our country as once it was. The issues for the European Union, if Britain does leave, are very obvious. I mean, there is no doubt that it would be damaging to the project. I think it will encourage a lot of right-wing groups within continental European politics. It will lead to pressures within other member states, which is one reason why it seems to me our partners are likely to hit us quite hard in terms of the terms that they offer for Britain for a future relationship. And obviously, it will confront the European Union with the ongoing issues of the Eurozone and the need, but also the difficulty of much greater further integration moving towards fiscal union within the Eurozone. So these are the issues that confront us. And at the moment, I would say it is absolutely touch and go how this referendum goes. At this dinner I was at last night, which was all pro-Europeans, the vast majority, when asked what they thought would be the outcome, said that they thought the outcome would be that Britain would vote to leave. And I hope it is clear from my remarks that I believe that this would be both an extraordinary misjudgment of our own self-interest, but much more importantly, an abandonment of our commitment to our friends, our neighbours, our partners, in a world that we have, however awkwardly, played our part in building over the last 40 years. Thank you very much.